Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating piece of homeopathic medical history, the chronic disease theory and the three triad miasms. For those of you who've ever wondered exactly how early practitioners made sense of those incredibly complex recurring illnesses, well, we're going to trace the origins of this absolutely foundational concept. We have to start in the early 1800s with a clinical mystery that literally plagued the founder of homeopathy, Samuel Hahnemann. I mean, imagine this scenario. You prescribe a perfectly selected acute remedy, your patient gets better, you pat yourself on the back, and then they relapse. The illness comes back, but it's deeper and it's much more stubborn. Hahnemann was pulling his hair out over this. Why do some illnesses seem completely cured only to return in a deeper form? So here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with that historical problem of relapse. Then we'll unpack the three chronic miasms, analyze a clinical history, and finally finish up with some absolutely crucial modern safety boundaries. Let's jump right into Section 1, the problem of relapse, the great medical mystery of the 19th century. The core issue driving all of this was a really frustrating cycle. Temporary improvement followed by inevitable relapse. Hahnemann noticed that while his acute prescriptions offered fleeting relief, the symptoms just stubbornly returned or even worsened over time. He realized that the acute complaints were actually just surface-level flare-ups of something much, much deeper. Hahnemann didn't just take a wild guess here, he obsessed over this. For 12 solid years, between 1816 and 1828, he engaged in this intense clinical investigation. He meticulously mapped the distinction between acute and chronic states, and this culminated in his 1828 publication, The Chronic Diseases. That book formalized his brand new miasmatic theory, which, as we know, later schools would continue to expand on. His conclusion, a total game changer. He hypothesized a persistent underlying cause that he called a miasm. Now think of a miasm as a constitutional vulnerability. It's a dynamic derangement of the vital force that produces chronic disease. And because it's so deeply rooted, it requires highly targeted, specific treatment to actually eradicate it. Moving on to Section 2, the three chronic miasms. Let's meet the foundational triad, Psora, Sycosis, and Syphilis. This framework is brilliant because it elegantly categorizes the sheer chaos of chronic illness into three primary groups. On one end, you have Psora, the sensitizing miasm. Think functional deficiency, anxiety, and an itch that gets way worse in the cold. In the middle is Sycosis, the overgrowth miasm. This one is all about excess, tissue infiltration, warts, a suspicious mind, and a real aversion to damp weather. And finally, Syphilis, the destructive miasm. We're talking structural decay, deep tissue necrosis, profound hopelessness, and symptoms that notoriously flare up at night. Classical texts urge practitioners to meticulously differentiate these states. And you really have to pay attention to the two furthest ends of the spectrum. You've got Psora on one side, which is purely functional irritation, and Syphilis on the other, which is actual structural destruction. Nailing this identification is crucial because it dictates the entire remedy selection. And that brings us to the golden rule of the whole framework. Never confuse functional irritation with structural destruction. You absolutely must separate the hypersensitivity of Psora from the deep necrotic tissue death of Syphilis. The big takeaway here, mixing these up doesn't just confuse the theory, it literally derails the patient's entire treatment plan. All right, Section 3. Analyzing the clinical history. This is where the practitioner gets to put on the hat of a medical detective. You see, constructing a miasmatic hypothesis isn't about jumping to a conclusion over one single isolated symptom. Practitioners have to collect a really deep longitudinal history. They map the onset of symptoms, record previous treatments, and explore family patterns. Though, a quick aside, the texts do explicitly warn against assuming every single family trait is a miasmatic certainty. You're really looking for corroborated, repeated patterns across time and systems. Let's look at a historical case vignette to really make this concrete. Imagine you have a 38-year-old patient presenting with recurring nasal polyps, thick catarrhs, and fleshy warts on the neck. Mentally, they're highly suspicious. And physically, practically every symptom they have gets worse in damp weather. So based on our triad matrix, the dominant hypothesis here is Sycosis. And why is that? Well, the polyps and the warts represent cellular hypertrophy, excess tissue growth, right? The suspicious nature aligns perfectly with the fixed mental state of psychosis. And that damp weather aggravation, that is a classic psychotic physical modality. To ensure clinical rigor and to completely avoid stereotyping, students follow a very strict 5-step reasoning pathway. Locate the source, describe the pattern, and form a hypothesis. But step 4 is arguably the most vital. Challenge it. Look for alternate explanations and constantly check your own biases. Finally, you apply it, but with limited, safe clinical use, evaluating the whole case constantly. Which brings us to our final section, boundaries and clinical safety. Time for the reality check. Over the last 2 centuries, this concept has obviously evolved. Modern schools interpret miasms a bit differently from one another. The classical school focuses on chronic causation, the constitutional on inherited susceptibility, pathological on tissue patterns, and thematic on psychology. The point being, practitioners have to clearly define which model they're actually applying, otherwise you risk total clinical confusion. Operating in these frameworks comes with some major risks, for sure. Practitioners really need to guard against confirmation bias, only noticing the features that neatly fit your preferred miasma. There's also the huge danger of stereotyping, reducing a wonderfully complex person to a fixed label. But the ultimate trap here is diagnostic substitution, replacing a much-needed modern biomedical diagnosis with a 19th century theory. Because of that, responsible use is vastly different from irresponsible use. Responsible use means treating the miasm purely as a provisional historical framework, one that refines the clinical picture but is always open to revision. Irresponsible use, on the other hand, treats the theory as absolute certainty, forces patient symptoms to fit the mold, and, tragically, delays standard medical care. We absolutely have to be clear on the hard boundary of clinical safety here. Miasmatic theory does not diagnose cancer, it doesn't diagnose infection, and it doesn't diagnose genetic disease. It is a historical, interpretive model. Progressive pathology requires conventional investigation. Homeopathic care must complement and never, ever displace necessary modern medicine. All of this leaves us pondering one final, critical question. How can practitioners successfully balance the incredibly rich historical value of this 19th century interpretive model with the strict, unyielding ethical demands of modern clinical responsibility? It's a fascinating tension to think about. Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and keep questioning.